So for our last segment tonight, we're talking about stability and progress and whether there's actually like some kind of tension here, right? Because if you think about it, like huge leaps forward in progress, societal progress, tend, or at least historically, are sometimes paired with periods of significant instability, right? Because like at the very least, social instability, riots, protests, stuff like that. At the highest end, like even like the Civil War, stuff like and violent protests and things like that. And so it's like, it's this question of whether it requires like discomfort and whether it requires like, discord in order to actually push for things to be accomplished.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of historical precedent to progress being driven by desperation. Because, I mean, it's kind of natural and intuitive that when people are content, they don't want to change the system. All right? They don't want to make massive changes. That can sometimes mean that progress can be stifled by stability.
Mm-hmm.
So let me give you an example. All right. Prior to the New Deal, there wasn't really much of a middle class. All right. It was mostly working class and elites in the United States. You didn't have a lot of labor protections, and people who were old were kind of just fucked. People that were disabled were kind of just fucked. But the biggest reason why the New Deal happened in the first place was because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression drove that progress. And what ended up happening was that the United States, the people of the United States, were actually significantly better off after the New Deal had happened than they were prior to even the start of the Great Depression. Because we didn't have Social Security. Now we do. We didn't have a minimum wage. Now we do. We didn't have a lot of labor protections. Now we do. We didn't have disability. We didn't have various welfare programs. Now we do. And that started because of instability. Now, I'm not saying that the Great Depression was a good thing. I don't want you to think that. But what I'm saying is that there does seem to be this tendency that when there is not a desperate push towards something, when there is not instability, either on a social or economic level, you very rarely have any progress. Now, I want to give you another little example. Let's take disability rights, for instance. All right. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is widely considered to be basically the Civil Rights Act for disabled people, was passed in 1990 by George H.W. Bush. And it was revolutionary for people with disabilities. Very few people knew about its existence at the time that it was passed. All right. And even after its passage, you still have very little controversy surrounding disability rights. All right. There does seem to be this universal tendency for both Democrats and Republicans to view disability in a light of, well, of course we want to help people with disabilities. And of course we don't want to take away disability rights. That's just a general consensus. It doesn't have the same controversy as things like, say, like racial justice. It doesn't have the same...
Like black people having rights. Yeah,
exactly. Or gay people having rights.
Yeah.
Or hell, women having rights. All right?
Yep.
It doesn't have the same type of controversy when you bring it up. It doesn't have the same partisan ire. So you would think that if there's a general consensus that we want to protect and preserve disability rights, that means that there has been progress since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Except there hasn't. There hasn't been pretty much any progress. I mean, okay, I should say, they did pass the ADA Amendments Act in, I believe, 2009. And that clarified some aspects of the ADA. But I would just like to point out, the reason why they did that was because there were several court cases prior to then that had limited the definition of disability when interpreting the Americans with Disabilities Act. So they basically had to pass laws to pass additional amendments to...
The courts were like, you know what? I don't know about including all these people with disabilities under the disability ADA.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
No,
Jesus.
there's some really fucked up history there. Like, did you know that that John Roberts at one point actually was a lawyer for, I think it was Toyota, in a lawsuit where someone was fired for having a disability, fired
Jesus.
by Toyota,
Oh
and
my
he
God.
represented Toyota.
I represent that John Roberts is receiving unduly kind treatment because he's not as batshit crazy as many of his colleagues on the bench. But
Yes.
he's still a fucking dildo in a robe.
That's such a good description. Because he's fucking America.
Amazing.
But yeah, like, so you had that, but again, that was in response to an issue. Like, that was in response to something that to a direct threat. All right. But the thing is, the Americans with Disabilities Act has a lot of limitations, and we haven't seen very much progress on the issue of disability since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And a huge reason, arguably, for that is because our view on disability has been stable. There hasn't been a lot of controversy surrounding it. And when you have stability, you don't have pushes for progress. Now, keep in mind, stability means a stable status quo. But if the status quo is flawed, then it's not necessarily worth defending.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's so interesting here because it's very tempting to think that, and I think I'm sympathetic to this point of view, that like, yeah, if we're going to make any progress, we have to have instability. History points in that direction, right? Like the United States, the most innovative form of government up to that point, was created as the result of a revolutionary war, right?
Yeah.
We freed Black people in the United States as a result of a war. Like the basis for the middle class was created as a result of the largest economic depression
in the
world prior to or since.
Yeah.
Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, like driven by the civil rights movement and like concerted efforts and protests. Like,
yeah. And not just that, but videos of Black protesters having the shit beat out of them by racists in the South, which kind of forced like what Martin Luther King referred to as the moderate whites to take a stand.
Yeah.
And, a lot of the so-called moderate whites saw that and were like, I can't be for that. So you got to be for the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah. And so it's really in every single one of these examples, until we cross the canyon, until we get on the other side of that, the tough, like that difficult period, it's worse for everybody, right? Like the inciting thing, the thing that kicks off the historic event that causes the turning point towards progress in these cases is desperation. It's things getting so fucking bad that you can't stand even a little bit more of it, right?
Yeah.
And that means that things were too bad. That's bad. You know, like, and so it's to your point about like when you said like, well, I don't want to say the Great Depression was good, but it led to all these good things. I agree with none of these things. I don't want to say the Revolutionary War was good.
Yeah.
Like thousands of people died. I don't want to say the Civil War was good. The outcome was good, but like the thing wasn't good. So it made me think like, why does it seem like the only way to bend towards progress is like misery? Yeah. And I think it's because the only way to force the hand of the people in power, who tend to be the people benefiting from stability, is to force the hand.
Yeah.
To do the forcing. And so it's interesting to think about that in contrast to the type of progress and progressivism that we talk about, because it's the only way out of the horrible misery that is the driving force behind all this progress.
Yeah.
Like the only thing to do is to actually, for the people in power to actually give a shit about the people that aren't necessarily in power and the people that are miserable to push that envelope to prevent everybody from suffering even more unnecessarily, so we can get beyond that, so we can get to the other side of the canyon to where we are actually making progress.
Yeah. And I would also like to make another important point. Sometimes that desperation goes in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes instability, which leads to a demand for more change, leads in a terrible direction. I gave the example of the Great Depression. In the United States, it led to the New Deal. In Germany, it led to Hitler.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, like all the yeah, of course. Like it's so interesting to think about, like, sorry, we fucked up your country, because often all the US did is poked and prodded things to get worse and worse and worse, and then boom, authoritarian dictatorship. Boom, Sharia law. Like you're right. You're absolutely right. We shouldn't pretend like the misery and instability naturally results in actual progress. It's just the spark that ignites something that hopefully goes in the right direction. Yeah. But we can avoid that. We can avoid all of that with good legislation and with people in power actually giving a shit about people that are miserable, people that need help. Like you could just skip that step and go straight to making things better. But we won't.
That's the thing. We're probably not going to.
That's the arc of history. Yeah.
The thing is, the last time we were in a position where we could have had a ton of progressive change, it was in 2016 after the Obama years, when people were still hurting from stagnant wages. Mm-hmm. People were still hurting from living paycheck to paycheck. And you had an appetite for Bernie Sanders, because like he came out of nowhere and, gave Hillary Clinton a run for her money. But you also had an appetite for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And it ended up going in the direction of Donald Trump. Yeah. And so we kind of missed our chance for any type of progressive change. Yeah. And the same thing happened the same thing kind of happened in 2020, because people were desperate from the pandemic for something else. Mm-hmm. And again, there was an appetite for Bernie Sanders. There was still a bit of an appetite for Trump, but less so, because people were tired of how badly he had fucked up. Yeah. But of course, Biden ended up winning. And I think part of that was because people had experienced the instability and they saw him as like more stable. Yeah. But at the same time, like, we did have an opportunity to create a lot of progressive change, and we did kind of blow it by picking Biden. Now, again, he beat Donald Trump, and that's good. And again, I would like to point out that in terms of policy, Biden has done better than any other United States president in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. There's a lot that he has done that has been good, and there's some landmark changes that he has made, but there's so much that he hasn't done. Yeah. All right. That he promised to do, and that we probably would have much more progress on, and we really if we had. Yeah, and that we really need. I mean, again, healthcare. We talked about this last week. He kind of just abandoned the public option, which the public option doesn't even go far enough. But at least it would be something. At least that would be a big, important change. So sometimes we get desperate, we go in the wrong direction, and we kind of miss our shot.
Yeah. I wonder how much of it is just a problem of like foresight. Like the fact that the near term is easier to see than the long term. Yeah. Like, it seems like it's pretty inevitable that if you keep making things worse for certain groups of people, like, it will drive instability, and ultimately there will be a spark that causes significant unrest, right? So it's like, okay, even if you view it in the worst possible terms of like giving up power, like wokeism is like helping power, like helping spread out who has power or whatever. Like, even if you do it in the worst possible terms, it's either do it now, voluntarily, slowly on your own terms, or do it later in an incendiary event that is of historical significance. Like white slave owners of the South, wouldn't you have rather? I mean, if we pretend that Lincoln wasn't replaced by a fucking like racist in sheep's clothing who is like trying to, destroy Reconstruction, but like wouldn't the slave owners in the South have preferred like freeing their slaves to having the South destroyed.
Yeah.
Right. Like if Jim Crow hadn't been a thing, kicked off by, what's his name, President Johnson, like they would certainly have preferred to unravel that horrible institution on their own economic terms. And I'm not saying that that's like the good thing or the better thing. I'm saying that's an argument for telling the people in power to loosen their grip on the reins, because otherwise they'll be wrenched from you. Yeah. So at the very least, but I don't think people can see that far ahead.
Yeah. And this is a point that I think that we've made before. Like, I've made the point before that if you want to save capitalism, you have to implement social democracy.
Yeah.
You have to, because people can only be pushed to a certain point. Mm-hmm. All right. People will only suffer from lack of healthcare to a certain point. People will only put up with a certain level of income inequality. And eventually it's going to go beyond the tipping point. When it was Bernie Sanders, that was us asking nicely. Yeah. All right. When we say give us Medicare for all, that's us asking nicely. When we say raise taxes on the rich, that's us asking nicely. When we say have free college tuition, that's us asking nicely. Mm-hmm. All right. That is allowing a system in which you still have capitalists and you still have rich people. Mm-hmm. And I assume that that's the type of system in which rich people would prefer. So the question is, do you want to continue to rich people? Because I'm sure that a lot of billionaires are probably listening to the podcast right now.
We're the number one podcast among billionaires.
The question is, would you rather pay a little bit more in taxes, only own as much wealth as you can spend in 10 lifetimes instead of 50,000 lifetimes? Or would you rather continue to push people to the breaking point and lose it all? Because that is where we are heading if you continue this shit. You want stability, and you have a vested interest in maintaining it.